G'day and welcome to Clayton Today. I'm Rod Earnshaw, and in this series we're looking at how to do church. And today the topic is reaching men. So where are all the men in our churches? Why is there such a gender imbalance? And how can we reach more men for Christ? To guide us in this discussion is Jonathan Pryke, Executive Minister at Jesmond Parish Church in the UK. G'day Jonathan, good to have you with us again.
G'day Rod, good to be back again.
Very good. I thought we'd just jump straight in and start with getting the facts. What is the gender balance like in the churches?
Well, from the point of view of having men in the churches, it's bad and it's getting worse, I think is the answer to that. Right. I mean, there was a survey done recently that shows that, looking at the UK, there were 65% women, 35% men, 2 women to every guy in the churches, and that's got worse as well. Right, so looking back to 1980, for instance, at that point, it was 43% men, 57% women. So it's drifted away quite a lot.
I guess it's worth asking the question, is that really a problem? Why is a gender balance like that a problem for us? Men
matter. Christ died for men as well as for women, so every individual matters. Men are hugely influential in the culture. It's not to say that women aren't, but men are as well. If I can just give you another statistic, can we have another statistic?
Yeah, please. Yes.
There was some research done about what happens when a member of a family becomes a Christian, which is quite fascinating. It was done in America, but again, I suspect that's a similar sort of pattern in the UK and other parts of the world. If a child in a family becomes a Christian, there's about a 3.5% probability that the rest of the family will become a Christian. If a mother becomes a Christian, something like 17% probability that the rest of the family will become Christian. If the father becomes a Christian, the probability is 93% that the rest of the family will become Christian as well. So that influence that men have in family life and indeed throughout the culture is something that we've really got to take seriously.
And so you've said that it's bad and it's getting worse. Do you have any ideas or thoughts on why that situation has come about and why why perhaps it does seem to be getting worse?
There's a fascinating book by a guy called Callum Brown called The Death of Christian Britain. He actually argues that this issue of what he calls the feminization of piety, a bit of a mouthful, but the feminization of piety goes right back to the beginning of the 1800s. And he gives quite a fascinating little example where he says that at that time, if you look at the way that angels are depicted, there was a sudden shift from angels being depicted in a masculine way, as they very often are in the Bible, but the angels suddenly started being depicted as women. And that has been reflected in the life of the church. And obviously you get a kind of vicious circle with this, as far as bringing the men in is concerned, because the more the whole environment becomes oriented towards women and female and feminized. Obviously, we've got to be very careful to try and avoid the sort of stereotypes. We're talking generalizations here, but nonetheless, when you have got a situation where 2/3 of the group are women, and so a lot of the ministry and so on is all geared towards the women, it becomes increasingly difficult for the men to feel at home, to feel that this is something for them.
Is that a sort of a cultural shift? Do you have any feel for that?
I mean, I think in a way, if anything, it's worse in Christianity in the West. Even than other, I mean, if you look at other religions, for instance, it's quite fascinating that if in the UK, there are actually more men involved in other religions than there are women.
The gender balance actually goes the other way. There's more men involved.
Yeah. It's not as if somehow, men are kind of, some sort of inherent unspirituality, lack of spirituality or lack of interest in religion. There does seem to be something going on within Christianity which is unhelpful in this regard.
What sort of impact does that have on men when they come into churches and there is that sort of 2/3, 1/3?
It's not that obviously we don't want to reach women, we do, but there's a kind of asymmetry in the way that men and women react, it seems to me, in different sort of situations and cultures that they face. Because a lot of situations that would be very friendly towards men, women, especially young women, want to be a part of that, and they find that very, very comfortable. Whereas a culture which is predominantly aimed towards women is not friendly in the same way towards men. Have we got time? Can I give you a little example of that?
Go on, just to shoot a quick one.
I mean, our church has laid on an event which is aimed at women, and it's called Fashion, Faith and Fundraising, right?
Now, I'm not interested already.
You're not interested. You're not interested, and I'm not interested. And why should we be? It's not aimed at us. It's aimed at the women. But a while ago, we laid on an event at the Newcastle Falcons Rugby Club in Newcastle upon Tyne, and it was a men's dinner at the rugby club. We had a leading rugby player who gave a testimony, and we had a talk and so on. And we got loads of complaints from the women that they wanted to be there as well. So there is that kind of lack of symmetry. Yeah.
Can we move on to solutions then? What do we do about this gender imbalance? How do we reach men for Christ?
I think there's a danger that we need to avoid, which is that we have a kind of approach which is sort of bolting on ministries which are aimed at men.
Like your rugby club.
Yeah, for instance, that's one possible kind of example. But you leave the sort of overall culture and the whole life of the church otherwise untouched.
So perhaps the men can come on Friday night, but they still won't come on the Sunday morning.
Yeah, you need to be much more radical than that and look at the whole life of the church and basically, I don't want to overstate this, but basically gear the church towards men. And then the women will come too. I think that's the point.
So you're not saying you don't want women to come.
Yeah.
You're not saying you don't want church to be friendly to women.
Yeah.
But you're saying it needs to be oriented towards the men, and the women will still be able to enjoy it. And
I think that's right, and you attract lots of women, lots of young women as well. I mean,
it sounds good in theory, Jonathan, but I want to move on to the practicalities. How do we do that? What would a church that's geared toward men look like?
Make sure that you have men in mind when you're preaching, when you're singing. It's really important to realise that men need male role models and male leadership. So you've got to provide that. You've got to deliberately go out to reach men, put resources into that.
I'd love you to give us some really practical examples, if you can think of some. What sort of thing do you think that would mean for church services?
Let me give you an example from our home groups recently. Sure. We've just started a new series looking at Paul's second letter to Timothy. It's quite fascinating because I had this topic in my mind as we were doing the study. And what you can see going on there is Paul discipling this younger man, and as he teaches him, he's using examples that are just male-oriented. So, for instance, he uses an illustration of being a soldier, of being an athlete, of being a farmer, and we just follow Paul's kind of example in that regard and make sure that the way that we're talking is a way that appeals to men. And in just the same way that Paul is discipling Timothy, that kind of thing also needs to go on in the church. So the older, mature Christian men need to make sure that they are working with the younger men, spending time with them, sharing their lives with them, talking about the scriptures, challenging them. I mean, this business of challenge is a very important issue. Do
you want to talk a bit more about that? What do you mean by challenge? Why is challenge particularly important?
There's, I mentioned one book. There's another fascinating book by a guy called David Murray called Why Men Hate Going to Church. And he says that one of the problems there is that there is an imbalance in the life of the church, and that there's too much emphasis on security and not enough on challenge. And we all need security, but men need to be challenged. And what is more, that is the New Testament pattern as well. I mean, Jesus was profoundly challenging in his
so perhaps at
teaching.
The end of the day, we're saying it's not really a male-female issue at all, so much as that we need to get back to actually issuing the challenges that the Bible issues for all of us.
Yeah.
If we're not issuing that challenge, we're not being faithful to what Jesus was saying.
Absolutely, and obviously that's why this does reach the women as well. And it's exactly right that what we need to be doing is getting back to the New Testament.
Great. I think that's almost a good spot to stop. Before we do, can you just remind us again, if people want to read a bit more, where can they go? What's some good books?
Well, I've got happen to have it with me. This is a book which is very stimulating. As often with books, I don't agree with everything he says, but it's a very stimulating read. Great. Why Men Hate Going to Church.
Lovely. Thanks, Jonathan. And thank you for watching. We hope today's discussion has prompted you to think about how your church might reach men for Christ. We're out of time, but do join us again for more discussion on Clayton Today. Goodbye. And thanks, Jonathan, again.